Okay, welcome. This is episode 3 of May You Live in Dysgenic Times. We're going to be doing the second half of Karl Pearson's 1909 pamphlet or short book, The Groundwork of Eugenics. I thought this was going to be a three-parter because I misread the page count. It's actually going to be a two-parter. So we did the first half, now we're going to do the second half. It is not the repression of human emotions, but the examination of life from a different, I will not venture to say higher, aspect, which leads some of us today to question whether the many social changes which soften life to the individual, which lessen the selective death rate, tend to the final welfare of humanity. The conception of the destruction of the less fit as a beneficent factor of human growth must become a part of our mental atmosphere. We must look upon it as a chief cause of our mental and physical growth of mankind in the past, not as a blind and hostile natural force, carelessly crushing the single life, but as the source of all we value in the intellect and physique of the highest type of mankind today. The time may come when human society can undertake for itself what natural selection has wrought for it in the past, but the suspension of the selective death rate must go step by step with reforms which shall consciously replace the vigorous effectiveness of the old system. Therein lies the purport of eugenics. For how does nature work through the selective death rate? Simply and effectively. By the death of those who cannot stand the strain of life, she removes the weaker stock before it has had any or its full quotum of offspring. When man knows better than at present what the qualities which fit him for his task and for his environment, he may consciously undertake what nature has done for him by her selective death rate. To prepare for this function is the true aim of the science of eugenics. But when the eugenist realizes the difficulties in his way, when he comes in the future to sum up his success and his failure, I fancy he will turn with a feeling akin to gratitude to that blind force of nature, the selective death rate, which led man in his younger days irresistibly along the path of progress. There are religious faiths which look upon pain as a divinely administered good, as a beneficial discipline. May not something of the same kind be realized by those who stand on the firm platform of evolutionary science in the 50th year of its life? Death, not the random archer of medieval notion, but the skillful marksman whose aim is planned, has been in the past and may perhaps long continue to be, the chief source of human progress as a whole. On the martyrdom of men is built the triumph of mankind. I have wandered somewhat from my point, the unstable character of human society owing to the selective death rate, but I would impress upon you the fact that unless the eugenist realizes the vastness of the forces at present at work in molding human life, he cannot hope to take definite action, an action based upon firm knowledge, when he comes to the criticism of present social tendencies. The eugenist, as far as lies in his power, has to replace the selective death rate by a selective birth rate. The past has depended for progress on natural selection. Can the future for progress depend on reproductive selection? My aim today is to insist on the gigantic part these two forces play in the evolution of human communities. You may not unreasonably say that I have so far talked much about the selective death rate, but given you no proof that natural selection really plays a part in human development. I gave the proof many years ago as a modest reply to Lord Salisbury's famous Oxford address, asserting that nobody has ever seen natural selection at work. Of course, no biologist paid any attention to my proof at the time, and it remained the special knowledge of biometricians, until Professor Plotz of Munich turned it up the day before yesterday and reasserted its correctness. The measure of the selective death rate is extraordinarily simple. It consists in the fact that the inheritance of the length of life between parent and offspring is found statistically to be about 1/3 of the average inheritance of physical characters in man. This can only be due to the fact that the death of parent or of offspring in a certain number of cases is due to random and not to constitutional causes. Let P be the chance of death from a random, not constitutional source, and then let 1 minus P. Then 1 minus P is the chance of a selective death in parent, and 1 minus p again of a selective death in the case of the offspring. Then 1 minus p squared must be equal to about 1 over 3 equals 36. I can't quite read this stuff on the PDF. More exactly, 0.6 and p equals 0.4. Okay. In other words, 60% of death are selective. I put this result, tested from many series, quite broadly, and I concluded that 50 to 75% of deaths in man were due to natural selection. I can bring this fact home to you by figures 5 and 6 of plate 3. It is the same matter looked at from another light. You will note the steady decrease of the death rate with the greater constitutional strength of the parents. In Table 1, I have taken female children up to 21, i.e. practically those that die before reproduction. You will see whenever constitutional defect involving early death occurs in the parent, the children die at the appalling rate of more than 70% before 21. If the parent be long-lived, then only 30% die early. My data are from well-to-do Quaker stocks, and this death rate is thus not the result of absence of care or means of livelihood. Professor Plotz, who suggested this method of examining the data, shows the exact same thing in 2 series of his own, one of middle class and the other of royal families where no neglect can be supposed. His results are shown in figures 3 and 4 of plate 3. He takes only the infantile mortality, that of under 5 years, and he concludes that 60% at least of deaths are purely selective. 60% at least of deaths are purely selective. Such is the demonstration of the enormous part which has been played by natural selection in man. 50 years after the publication of The Origin of Species, it is purely idle to discuss, as our leading journal did the other day, whether natural selection has or has not application to man. Has or has not application to man. It has been demonstrably a really gigantic factor of continuous change in human societies. If I turn to my second factor of social instability, the differential birth rate, I must strive to convince you that the reproductive selection is only second to natural selection in its vast-reaching effects on human life. If society is to reproduce itself without change from generation to generation, then, accepting the inheritance of human characters, each subclass of the community endowed with its special grade of intelligence or physique must be equally fertile. If it is not, then the successive generations will not be identical and can only be made identical owing to a selective death rate. There are few persons who realize on how relatively small a portion of each population the next generation depends. We have first to consider that many never reach the reproductive age at all. Here is the chief harvest of the selective death rate. In England, 1,000 males born in England of 1,000 males born, only 680 live to be 20, and of 1,000 women, only 708. Of these adults, we have next to estimate how many never marry or die without offspring. Here is the field not only of the selective death rate, but of the selective marriage rate. It is very difficult for many English statistics to determine how many adults never marry. No information on this point is asked in the death schedule for males. It is asked, but imperfectly answered, in the case of the schedule for females. From statistics of other countries, it seems to me that about another 20% or 30% of adults never marry. Just a sidebar here for anyone, this is not from the text, but if you look up the Hainaut line or the Hajnal line, this is kind of particular to Western and Northern Europe. It's different case in other parts of the world. To be on the safe side, let us say that 50 to 60% of those born leave no offspring. Lastly, among those who do marry, how are the offspring distributed? Clearly, those who have large families are responsible for a relatively large proportion of the next generation. Figure 7, plate 4 illustrates the distribution of the size of completed families in Quaker stocks. You will notice at once that the mean family is about 4.2 children. On the other hand, about half the families have less, half more than 3.3 children. Let us call families with less than 3.3 children subfertile, and those with more superfertile. Let us ask what relative amount of offspring the 50% of subfertile and the 50% of superfertile parents produce. The dotted curve gives the answer. It represents in percentages the total number of children produced, and we find the 50% of subfertile parents only provide about 25% of the next generation, whereas the superfertile parents give 75%. This law is practically universal for mankind. It has been confirmed for Denmark and for New South Wales. 50% of the married population provides 70% of the next generation, 75%. 50% of the next generation is produced by 25% of the married population, or about 12% of all the individuals born in the last generation provide half of the next generation. This is not only a general law, but it is practically true for each class in the community. This law of mine holds in a lessened degree for other forms of life. It appears to reach its highest intensity in the case of man, and I believe that this is largely due to certain artificial features of his civilization. At least the case of the thoroughbred racehorse with its artificial conditions tends to conform to this view. Be this as it may, it is of vital importance for the eugenist to realize how relatively small an element of human society is responsible for the next generation. I want to emphasize this still more emphatically. Let us assume that the 25% superfertile element in the population has a lower average intelligence than the subfertile 75%. If you look at Figure 9, Plate 4, giving the distribution of intelligence in the population, based upon observations of about 4,000 school children and 1,000 Cambridge graduates, you will see that 25% corresponds to about the range of slow, dull, and mentally defective. I have taken 100 units of intelligence, which I term mentaces, to correspond to the range of the intellects which fall between the specially able and the average man. Now, if we assume that the imbecile has 0 intelligence, you will find that the average man has about 300, or perhaps rather more mentaces. And if we define genius to be about the 1 man in 1,000 level of ability, the genius has some 600 or 700 mentaces. Now, if we divide our population at 25%, the mean number of mentaces in this rather slow and dull group is 173, and of the 75%, 342, the average man having 300 mentaces. Now notice what happens if the line between the subfertile and the superfertile be that of intelligence. In the next generation, there will be 50% of lower and 50% of the higher grade of intelligence, with an average for the whole community of 257 mentaces, a fall of 43 mentaces in the general ability of the population. In the next stage of the superfertile increase to 78% of the population, and the average has fallen to 210 mentaces. In the third generation, the superfertile element has risen to 98% of the whole, and the average intelligence has fallen to 180 mentaces. In Figure 10, Plate 4, this drop is represented by the continual decrease in the areas of the circles as the lower intelligences with the higher fertility rapidly predominate. You will note the progression from genius towards extreme dullness. To impress this dwindling of a character owing to reproductive selection on my readers, I will suppose as a second illustration that cranial capacity is associated with the subfertile group. Skull 1 to the right of Plate 1 marks the average man, and skulls 2, 3, and 4, the defective, the degeneration skulls 2, 3, and 4, the degeneration which would follow in 3 generations. I do not intend by this to assert that intelligence is proportional to cranial capacity. It is not. But I want to emphasize the deterioration which must follow association between fertility and inferiority in any racially valuable characteristic. Bear those skulls in mind, and you will not easily forget the rate of degeneration which must follow any differentiation of the intelligence or worth of the population into superfertile and subfertile groups. What I have said here applies not only to intelligence and cranial capacity, but to every quality which may be associated with a differentiated grade of fertility. I do not think anything could be more eugenically impressive than this principle, that if fertility be correlated with any character, the population must be unstable. And now I want to make a somewhat remarkable admission. Not only in man, but in other types of life, it is extremely hard to find any character, whatever, which organically is markedly associated with fertility. Nature seems to have effectually hindered living forms from undoing by reproductive selection her great achievements produced by natural selection. It will be obvious to you that if one class which has died twice as fast as a second yet produced 3 times as many offspring, the increased fertility would more than compensate for the selective death rate. I do know characters which are slightly related to fertility in man, notably a character which I will term toughness of constitution, and measurable by longevity. The husband and wife who live to 80 will have, on the average, before 50 years of age, more children than a pair who live only to 65. But in nature as a whole, there is little relation of fertility to any good or bad qualities of the individual. Where, then, is the moral of my tale, if there be no organic correlation between fertility and intelligence? The answer lies in emphasizing the word organic. What nature has avoided, man has artificially produced. This is the kernel of the whole matter for the science of eugenics. Approach the problem as we will, the conclusion forced upon us is ever the same. The physically inferior, the mentally slow, are not naturally more fertile than the stronger in body and mind, but they are in our community today the more fertile, and the process of deterioration, as I have exaggerated in that series of skulls, is in progress. The moment we suspend the full vigor of natural selection, the moment we artificially correlate fertility with any defect of physique or intelligence, we start that downward movement. To check this movement, I will take to the special function of practical eugenic action. The correlation between fertility and unfitness will no doubt be discussed more fully later in these lectures, but I should like to indicate how complex the problem is, how very difficult it is to obtain the facts one desires to know from the manner in which returns are to be made in government statistical offices. One has to turn to the countries of the other world to get data which ought to be provided in this. And then the social conditions are so different that we have to allow for wide possibilities of divergence in our results. If we look upon society as an organic whole, we must assume that class distinctions are not entirely illusory, that certain families pursue definite occupations because they have a more or less special aptitude for them. In a rough sort of way, we may safely assume that the industrial classes are not, on the average, as intelligent as the professional classes, and that the distinction is not entirely one of education. Now, the points we have to bear in mind are the following. 1, the size of completed families. 2, the child mortality. 3, the relative marriage rate. 4, the relative adult death rate for each class. Only when we know all these fully shall we be quite certain as to how the different classes in a community are altering. New South Wales is one of the few countries where such data are effectively recorded, and Table 3 illustrates the nature of the successive allowances to be made. The table refers to the size of families of various social classes at death or of one or other parent. The order of fertility is pastoral, industrial, commercial, domestic, and last professional. Although the percentage of child deaths are different in each of the different classes, yet the net offspring, or those that survive to 15, are in the same class order. Each industrial family has on average half a child more surviving than the average professional family. So far the balance is still in the favor of the industrial class. But the next column shows you that this is not the whole gain. The industrial classes are marrying at a far more rapid rate than any other class. 5 industrial marriages take place for every 4 professional marriages and roughly for every 2 pastoral marriages. These rates are not true for Europe. Westergaard and Rubin believe that the marriage rate of the professional classes in Denmark to be 1/3 less than that of the industrial classes. In our own country, I doubt whether the professional marriage rate exceeds half that of the industrial classes. Again, The small marriage rate of the pastoral classes would only apply to a country where the agriculturalist is largely a pioneer. So far, however, the race is markedly in favor of the industrial as compared to the professional group. But here a new feature comes in. The industrial classes may need a larger increase because their wastage is greater. In the next column, I have placed the death rates for the several classes, considering only adults over 20. We find the death rate is selective, but it by no means compensates for the greater marriage rate and the greater net birth rate. In the last column, I have allowed for marriage and death rates of the various classes and obtained what I term the fertility weight of the different classes. The lesson to be learned from this last column is twofold. One, that society is not a stable whole. The different social classes multiply at very different rates. And two, that society recruits itself from below, the rate of reproduction of the industrial classes being 30% greater than that of the professional classes. We cannot apply these results directly to the state of affairs in England. The marriage rate of the professional classes is much lower, and of the pastoral classes higher. The relatively low rate of those in domestic employment is of course maintained, but the inadequate multiplication of the domestic class is met by recruits, perhaps as much from the pastoral as from the industrial classes. My object, however, is not to draw out conclusions as to social classes, but to point out that our principle of treatment must be the same whether we deal with social classes, intellectual grades, or mentally or physically defective groups. We have in each case to investigate their fertility weight as compared with that of other types. The aim of the eugenist is to enforce the principle that society in every case must recruit itself from above, where above has now to be interpreted not as referring to a social class level, but to the group with the higher grade of the nationally desirable characteristic. Thus far, we have seen the large part played by selective death rates, selective birth rates, and selective marriage rates in determining the nature of the community. And in this, you may have realized how the science of eugenics is really embraced in the statistical or actuarial study of the growth of human society. But a study of death and fertility would carry us but little way, had we not some measure of how the parental characters of each differentiated group are handed down to their offspring. The results I am going to try and impress upon you in conclusion today are based upon the measurement of more than 1,000 families, and as will be shown to you in later lectures, may be considered closely true not only for physical, not only for pathological, but for mental characters. Man and woman do not mate at random. Our measurements and observations show that for practically all characters there is a selective mating. Like tends in a sensible but small degree to mate with like. Assuming this assortive mating to exist, let us term exceptional the man or woman who possesses more of a given character than every 19 persons out of 20. Thus the tallest man in a random 20 shall be called exceptionally tall. The best in a random class of 20 students exceptionally intelligent. There is nothing more in a definition of what we will call for the time being exceptional. Now I find from our study of the inheritance of human characters that 52 marriages in 10,000 are of an exceptional man and woman. 9,948 pairs of which neither or only one are exceptional. In the 52 exceptional marriages, exceptional children are produced in the ratio of nearly 26 exceptional to 26 unexceptional, or about half the children are exceptional. Of the 9,948 unexceptional pairs, the ratio will be 474 exceptional to 9,474 unexceptional children, or rather, less than 1/20th of the children will be exceptional. Thus, while 18 times as many exceptional children will be born of commonplace as of exceptional parents, the commonplace pairs only produce exceptional children at 1/10 the rate of the exceptional parents. That great men are usually born of commonplace parents is only a paradox when we forget that the commonplace pairs of parents are 200 times as frequent as pairs of exceptional parents, and that accordingly the small chance of an exceptional son occurring to any commonplace pair is made up for by the far greater number of such pairs. The model photographed in Plate 2 is an endeavor to illustrate the point on which, After all, most eugenic inquiries must turn. In the relatively small cube in the corner is a profusion of individuals represented by black peas, bearing the character you want for national purposes. In the great mass of the general population, represented by the remainder of that cube, you see the sparsity of persons gifted with this advantageous character. The bulk do not possess it, or perhaps possess its opposite, a detrimental attribute. Even in the general population, the majority of these scattered black peas would be found concentrated round the exceptional corner. Now, grasp this to the full. A minority in the community producing the colored or desirable in profusion, a majority producing the desirable very sparsely, and the colorless or undesirable profusely. Grasp further that social and political measures have reduced and will continue to reduce the stringency of the selective death rate between these two classes. In the present state of social feeling, we have only one resource for remedying this, the selective birth rate. In the light of the recent work of Heron and others, can we definitely place our fingers on any desirable social characteristic today which has a selective birth rate in its favor? I believe that there is not a single character which makes for national welfare, which can be shown definitely to be favored by a selective birth rate at the present time. Social conditions have allowed prepotent birth rate to be associated with a tabid and wilted stock. It would matter little were not the same conditions suspending also the old selective death rate. Combined, these two factors must give in the future the degeneracy I have endeavored to illustrate tonight. These are the chief lessons which biological truths, as applied to man, have to teach us. Natural fertility is not markedly associated with good or bad characteristics. Given a high birth rate and a heavy death rate, nature will preserve and advance her human type with a cruelty to the individual which social feeling is too strong at present to permit of, and political power too democratic to leave unchecked. Yeah, right. But when the selective death rate is reduced as far as legislation, municipal hygiene, state support, medical progress, and unlimited charity can reduce it, then what means are left by which mankind can consciously undertake the task which nature has hitherto so ruthlessly carried out? With the advance of civilization, the birth rate as well as the death rate has become more and more artificial, but it has become artificial in an individualistic and antisocial way. The purport of eugenics is to study the causes of this change, to create a strong public opinion, a new moral sense on this cardinal factor of national welfare. A progressive and imperial nation can only afford to be kind to its weak in body or mind if that kindness synchronizes with the determination that each successive generation shall be born better. We have to take social customs as we find them. We must recognize to the full that human fertility changes in highly civilized states from the natural to the artificial phase. Such change led, in my opinion, to the collapse of the great civilizations of the ancient world. It will lead to the downfall of the great civilizations of today unless our clear scientific insight enables us to recognize, our more intense social spirit leads us to stem in time, the ills which will inevitably flow from the suspension of the selective death rate and the artificial creation of a cacogenic selective birth rate. It is 100 years since Charles Darwin was born, 50 years since he turned the searchlight of natural selection on the dark mystery of living forms. It is fitting that this anniversary year should proclaim the knowledge thus gained has a great practical application to the welfare of human societies. The coping stone is not of necessity the most structurally important block in every building, yet asserting that the science of eugenics forms the coping stone of the science of life, we shall emphasize that the highest function of science is to be of direct practical service to man. The lower functions are to discipline and train his mind, to occupy and interest his leisure. The fitness of eugenics as an academic branch of study lies not alone in the training it requires, which carries us at the same time into the new world of biological conceptions and into the older world of accurate quantitative analysis. It lies also in the groundwork it supplies for the treatment of those great social problems, on the adequate and expeditious solution of which lies, in the opinion of the more thoughtful men and women of today, the main, if not the sole, safeguard for future national progress. Alright, that is the end of it. So this was the second half of Karl Pearson's Groundwork of Eugenics. I hope you enjoyed it, because I certainly enjoyed reading it, and I find I can pay better attention if I read it out loud than if I read to myself, and then I'm apt to get distracted. Hey, Bill. I haven't yet given any commentary on the stuff that I've read so far, but maybe it might be useful to. So Karl Pearson says in this book that we're not going to worry about killing off any of the defective people. He says that social mores, social values are going to completely prohibit that, so there's no point in even talking about it. He says that the only thing that they should or could try to do is try to encourage births amongst the upper classes of intellectual or health, what, like he says, whatever you think the desirable characteristics are, because civilization tends to exert a deleterious impact on the what would you call it, like the genetic quality of the people in the nation, because all of the ones who would normally be killed by their own defects, or not all of them, but a lot of them, more than would survive otherwise, they're kept alive and they have children, so those problems tend to proliferate rather than become lessened. And I don't really think there's any kind of rational or logical counter argument to that. It makes pretty good sense, and it's kind of funny, because if you read this, it really brings about the Mike Judge movie Idiocracy. So if you read something like this and then go watch the film, I mean, you're kind of just seeing like 500 years in the future of exactly what Pearson and Fisher and Galton and the rest of these people were talking about. All right, I think we're going to wrap it up. Thank you for your time.